Guadalcanal, 1942. American Marines searching the body of a dead Japanese soldier made a strange discovery. The soldier had no food in his pack. His ammunition pouches contained fewer than 20 rounds. His rifle was caked with rust. But in his breast pocket, wrapped carefully in waxed paper, was a pristine toothbrush. This wasn't an isolated case. Across the Pacific Theater, from Burma to the Philippines, from New Guinea to Iwo Jima, Allied soldiers noticed the same bizarre pattern. Japanese soldiers carried toothbrushes religiously. They maintained dental hygiene even while starving to death. They cleaned their teeth even when they had no bullets left to fire. American intelligence officers were baffled. Why would an army prioritize toothbrushes over ammunition? Why would soldiers maintain personal hygiene while their weapons fell apart? The answer reveals something profound about the Imperial Japanese Army, something that explains both its extraordinary discipline and its catastrophic failures. Something that helps explain why Japan lost the war despite the fanatical courage of its soldiers. This is the story of an army that prepared its soldiers for spiritual purity, but not for modern war. An army that emphasized ritual over logistics. An army that could produce soldiers willing to die, but couldn't keep those soldiers supplied with the tools to fight. This is the story of why every Japanese soldier carried a toothbrush, but not enough bullets. To understand the toothbrush, you must understand the Japanese military philosophy that dominated the Imperial Army from the 1920s through 1945. Seishin Kyoiku, or spiritual education. The concept had deep roots in Japanese culture, drawing from Bushido warrior traditions, Zen Buddhism, and an interpretation of Shinto spiritualism. But in the hands of militarists in the 1920s and 1930s, it became something more extreme, a belief that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness. The philosophy held that Japanese soldiers, through proper spiritual cultivation, superior discipline, and absolute loyalty to the emperor, could defeat enemies with greater firepower, better equipment, and superior logistics. The spirit of the soldier, his Seishin, mattered more than the number of bullets in his pouch or the food in his stomach. This wasn't just philosophical rhetoric. It became official military doctrine. Field Marshal Sadao Araki, Minister of War from 1931 to 1934, championed Seishin doctrine aggressively. He argued that Japan's soldiers, properly trained in spiritual matters, could defeat Western materialism through sheer force of will. Araki wrote, "The true strength of an army lies not in steel and explosives, but in the spirit of its soldiers. One Japanese soldier, imbued with the proper spirit, equals 10 enemy soldiers who rely on material advantage." This doctrine permeated every aspect of Japanese military training. Physical hardship was deliberately imposed to build spiritual strength. Soldiers were beaten regularly, not as punishment, but as character building. They were starved during training to teach them that hunger was a mental state to be overcome. And they were taught that personal discipline, including hygiene, was an expression of spiritual refinement. A soldier who maintained his toothbrush demonstrated self-control, ritual observance, and respect for proper form. These were considered more important than tactical proficiency or logistical preparation. The toothbrush became a symbol. It was small, light, required no resupply, and represented the soldier's ability to maintain discipline regardless of external circumstances. Officers inspected soldiers' teeth as rigorously as their rifles, sometimes more so. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the Imperial Army's most influential staff officers, embodied this philosophy perfectly. He believed Japanese soldiers could march farther, fight longer, and endure more than any other army simply through superior spirit. He planned military operations based on this assumption, often with disastrous results. But the Seishin Doctrine wasn't entirely irrational. It had worked, or seemed to work, in Japan's previous conflicts. During the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, Japanese forces had defeated a larger, better-equipped Russian army through aggressive tactics, night attacks, and willingness to accept casualties that Russians found unacceptable. Japanese soldiers charged Russian machine gun positions with bayonets and won through sheer numerical persistence and willingness to die. The lesson Japanese military theorists drew from this victory was that spirit conquered material. They failed to note that Japan had also mobilized impressive logistics, received foreign loans to fund the war, and faced a Russian army hampered by 5,000 miles of single-track railway supply line. In the 1930s, campaigns in China, Japanese forces consistently defeated larger Chinese armies. Again, Japanese officers attributed this to superior Seishin rather than to the Chinese forces' lack of unified command, poor training, inadequate equipment, and political fragmentation. By 1941, when Japan launched its war against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, the Seishin Doctrine was so deeply embedded that questioning it was considered treasonous. Officers who suggested that logistics mattered as much as spirit were sidelined or sent to remote posts. The result was an army that prepared its soldiers for spiritual challenges, but neglected practical ones. An army that could march its soldiers into battle, but couldn't keep them supplied once they got there. An army that emphasized what the individual soldier carried on his person, but paid little attention to the supply lines that should have supported him. The toothbrush represented everything the Japanese army valued: personal discipline, ritual observance, spiritual purity, self-sufficiency. Ammunition represented what the army neglected: logistics, supply chains, industrial capacity, and the unglamorous mathematics of modern warfare. The Imperial Japanese Army's logistics system, or lack thereof, was the fundamental reason soldiers carried toothbrushes, but not enough bullets. To understand the scope of the problem, consider basic numbers. A Japanese infantry division in 1941 consisted of approximately 20,000 men. Each soldier was supposed to carry 120 rounds of ammunition for his rifle. That's 2.4 million rounds per division just for basic load. In sustained combat, infantry units consumed approximately 100-200 rounds per soldier per day. That's 2 to 4 million rounds daily for a single division in active combat. Over a month, that's 120 million rounds. Now multiply that by the dozens of divisions Japan deployed across the Pacific, China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. The ammunition requirements were staggering, billions of rounds annually. Japan's industrial capacity couldn't produce this quantity. In 1941, Japanese factories produced approximately 600 million rifle rounds annually. The United States produced 4 billion. By 1944, American production reached 12 billion rounds yearly. Japan's production actually declined to 400 million due to bombing and resource shortages. But production was only the first problem. The ammunition then had to be transported to soldiers spread across millions of square miles of ocean and jungle. Japan's merchant marine in 1941 consisted of about 6 million tons of shipping. This sounds substantial until you realize that shipping had to supply not just the military, but also Japan's civilian economy, which depended on imported food, oil, and raw materials. The military's logistical doctrine made things worse. The Japanese Army and Navy maintained separate supply systems and often competed for the same shipping. Inter-service rivalry was so severe that Army units could be starving on one island, while Navy supply ships full of food sailed past to Navy installations on another island, refusing to share. Supply doctrine also reflected Seishin philosophy. Japanese logistical planning assumed soldiers would live off the land, foraging, requisitioning from local populations, and capturing enemy supplies. This might work for a short campaign in fertile areas with large populations, but it failed catastrophically on barren Pacific islands or in prolonged campaigns. The Guadalcanal campaign illustrated the problem perfectly. Japanese forces landed on Guadalcanal in July 1942. Initial supplies were adequate, but once American forces arrived and contested the island, Japanese supply ships faced air and naval attacks. Rather than acknowledge that controlling sea and air approaches was essential for resupply, Japanese commanders continued sending troops to Guadalcanal while failing to secure supply lines. Soldiers were expected to defeat the Americans through superior spirit while starving. Lieutenant Tadashi Suzuki, who survived Guadalcanal, wrote in his diary, "We have been told that the supply situation will improve. It has not. We eat grass, tree bark, anything. Our ammunition is rationed, 5 rounds per day. But we are told to keep our teeth clean and our spirits high. The toothbrush I guard carefully. What good is a rifle with no bullets?" This pattern repeated across the Pacific. On New Guinea, Japanese soldiers starved by the thousands while maintaining their toothbrushes. On Bougainville, soldiers conducted banzai charges with bayonets because they had no ammunition, but their teeth were clean. The Japanese logistics system had another fundamental flaw. It was primarily one way. Supplies moved forward to combat units, but there was little systematic evacuation of wounded, rotation of exhausted units, or retrograde logistics. This reflected the Seishin doctrine that soldiers should fight until victorious or dead. There was no planning for withdrawal or rest. Medical logistics were particularly neglected. Japanese Army medical services were primitive compared to American or British systems. There were few field hospitals, minimal surgical capacity, and almost no medical evacuation system. Wounded soldiers were expected to heal and return to their units or die. The concept of evacuating wounded to rear area hospitals was considered a wasteful use of transport capacity. This created a vicious cycle. Sick and wounded soldiers stayed with their units, consuming scarce food and reducing combat effectiveness, but receiving inadequate medical care. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever devastated Japanese units not because the diseases were untreatable, but because the logistics system couldn't deliver medicine to where it was needed. Supply priorities reflected the Seishin philosophy. When shipping was available, priority went to reinforcements, fresh soldiers with proper spirit, rather than supplies for existing units. New units arrived with initial equipment, but no sustainable supply line. They were expected to capture what they needed from the enemy or forage from the environment. American intelligence officers noticed that captured Japanese supply documents often included toothbrushes, shoe polish, and cleaning supplies in the same priority category as ammunition. Personal hygiene items were considered essential. They maintained spiritual discipline. Extra ammunition was considered less urgent. Spiritual strength would overcome firepower disadvantage. The Japanese army also failed to develop adequate forward supply infrastructure. Unlike American forces, who built extensive supply depots, warehouses, and logistics hubs, Japanese forces often piled supplies on beaches or in jungle clearings, with minimal protection from weather or enemy action. Ammunition stored improperly in tropical climates deteriorated. Powder became damp. Brass corroded. By the time soldiers needed the ammunition, much of it was unusable. But the toothbrush, carefully maintained by the individual soldier, remained in perfect condition. The toothbrush philosophy extended throughout Japanese military training, which prepared soldiers for spiritual challenges while neglecting practical combat skills. Basic training for Japanese soldiers was brutal, designed to break down individual identity and rebuild soldiers as instruments of the emperor's will. Recruits were beaten daily. This was called Seishin, spiritual forging. The beatings weren't punishment for specific infractions. They were part of the training process. Private Masao Nishikawa, who completed basic training in 1943, later testified, "We were struck every day, with fists, with sticks, with rifle butts, for being too slow, too fast, too loud, too quiet, for any reason or no reason. We were told this built our spirit, made us strong. What it actually did was teach us to endure pain and to inflict pain on others." The beatings cascaded down the hierarchy. Officers beat sergeants. Sergeants beat corporals. Corporals beat privates. Newer recruits were beaten by slightly less new recruits. This created a culture of violence that extended to treatment of prisoners and civilians. But within this brutal system, personal hygiene received enormous attention. Soldiers spent hours on uniform maintenance, equipment cleaning, and personal grooming. Inspections focused on whether boots were properly polished, whether the soldier had shaved correctly, and whether teeth were clean. Lieutenant Colonel Seizo Arisue, who oversaw training at a depot in Manchuria, explained, "A soldier who maintains proper appearance demonstrates self-discipline. This discipline translates to combat effectiveness. A soldier who can keep his teeth clean under any circumstances will not break in battle." This logic seemed reasonable in the abstract, but it resulted in training that emphasized form over function. Soldiers spent more time learning how to properly clean their rifles for inspection than learning how to maintain them in field conditions. They learned parade ground drill extensively, but received minimal training in small unit tactics. Marksmanship training was particularly inadequate. Ammunition was scarce, so live fire training was minimal. Soldiers often graduated from basic training, having fired fewer than 100 rounds. By comparison, American soldiers fired thousands of rounds during basic training. Instead of marksmanship, Japanese training emphasized bayonet charges. Soldiers practiced charging straw dummies, screaming battle cries, and delivering bayonet thrusts. This was considered spiritually superior to rifle marksmanship. It involved direct confrontation with the enemy, testing the soldier's courage and spirit. The problem was that bayonet charges against entrenched positions with machine guns were suicidal. But Seishin doctrine held that a properly motivated soldier, charging with absolute commitment to death, would overcome defensive fire through sheer spiritual force. Night attack training was extensive. Japanese forces excelled at night operations, infiltration, and close combat in darkness. This was a practical skill that played to Japanese strengths: individual initiative, small unit cohesion, and willingness to operate in difficult conditions. But even night attack training reflected spiritual priorities over practical ones. Soldiers learned to navigate by stars and natural landmarks rather than using compasses or maps. They were taught to move silently through jungle or forest by developing heightened spiritual awareness rather than using modern navigation techniques. Physical conditioning was intense. Japanese soldiers could march extraordinary distances, carrying heavy loads. They developed endurance that impressed even their enemies. But this endurance training often came at the expense of technical training. A typical Japanese soldier's training included 6 to 8 hours daily of physical conditioning and drill, 2-3 hours daily of equipment, maintenance, and cleaning, 1 to 2 hours daily of Seishin education, lectures on loyalty, spirit, and duty, 1 to 2 hours of bayonet and hand-to-hand combat training, less than 1 hour of marksmanship and tactics. Compare this to American training, which emphasized marksmanship. Soldiers fired thousands of rounds. Small unit tactics and coordination map, reading and navigation radio communication, combined arms operations, physical conditioning. The Japanese soldier emerged from training as a spiritually indoctrinated physically tough, personally disciplined individual. But he often lacked basic combat skills like accurate shooting, tactical flexibility, or communication procedures. The toothbrush symbolized the training philosophy. It was something the soldier maintained himself, requiring no external support. It was a ritual that demonstrated personal discipline. It was something that could be inspected easily to verify the soldier's spiritual state. Bullets required industrial production, complex supply chains, and logistical support, things the Japanese military system was poorly equipped to provide. So training emphasized what the system could provide: spiritual indoctrination and personal discipline. The toothbrush over the bullet. When Japanese soldiers entered combat, the contradictions between spiritual doctrine and material reality became deadly. The initial Japanese offensive from December 1941 through mid-1942 seemed to validate Seishin doctrine. Japanese forces conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and dozens of Pacific islands in 6 months. This appeared to prove that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. But the victories had less to do with Japanese spirit than with surprise and initiative, poor Allied preparation and coordination, air and naval superiority in the initial phase, shorter supply lines than their enemies, fighting colonial armies with limited motivation. As the war progressed and these advantages disappeared, the weaknesses of the Seishin system became catastrophic. Guadalcanal represented the turning point. Japanese forces landed on Guadalcanal expecting a short campaign, followed by consolidation. Instead, they faced a prolonged battle of attrition against well-supplied American forces. Japanese soldiers quickly ran short of ammunition. Diaries recovered from dead soldiers tell the same story repeatedly. August 20th, 1942. We attacked the American positions tonight. Many of us had only 5 or 6 bullets. We were told to use the bayonet and our spirit. We charged. American machine guns killed most of my platoon. I do not understand how spirit overcomes bullets. Corporal Hidechi Sato. September 15th, 1942. No food for 6 days. We eat grass and tree bark. Some men have died from hunger. We have been ordered to attack again tomorrow. We have 15 bullets per man. Our officers tell us this is enough because our spirit is superior. Our spirits are strong, but our bodies are weak. Private Takeshi Yamada. October 3rd, 1942. I have cleaned my teeth today, as every day, though I have not eaten in 4 days. Lieutenant Nakamura inspected us and praised those with clean teeth. He said this demonstrates the proper spirit. Tomorrow, we attack again. I have 3 bullets remaining. I wonder if my spirit will be enough. Private First Class Isamu Tanaka. The pattern repeated across the Pacific. On New Guinea, Japanese forces launched offensive operations without adequate ammunition or food. Units attacked with 20 and 30 rounds per soldier, expecting to capture American supplies. When the attacks failed, soldiers were trapped in the jungle without supplies and no plan for resupply. Major General Tomitaro Horii commanded the South Seas force that attacked Port Moresby. His orders emphasized spiritual preparation, but barely mentioned logistics. When his offensive stalled on the Kokoda track, supply lines collapsed. Soldiers starved by the thousands. Horii himself drowned attempting to cross a river during the retreat, his body weakened by malnutrition, like his soldiers. Japanese defensive tactics also reflected spiritual priorities over practical ones. Rather than using defense in depth, flexible responses, or tactical withdrawals, Japanese forces typically defended fixed positions with orders to fight to the last man. This made spiritual sense. Defending to the death demonstrated ultimate loyalty, but it was tactically disastrous. Fixed defenses allowed Americans to concentrate firepower. Japanese soldiers, forbidden to withdraw even when their positions became untenable, died in place without accomplishing anything beyond their own destruction. The famous banzai charges epitomized the contradiction. When Japanese units ran low on ammunition, commanders often ordered mass bayonet charges rather than tactical withdrawal or conservation of forces. These charges were presented as demonstrations of superior spirit. In reality, they were waste of trained soldiers. American machine guns, artillery, and rifle fire slaughtered charging Japanese troops. The charges rarely succeeded militarily, but they fulfilled spiritual requirements. Soldiers died demonstrating absolute loyalty. Sergeant Kiyofumi Kojima, one of the rare survivors of a banzai charge on Saipan, later testified, "We were told we would break the American lines through the power of our spirit. We had few bullets, so we were ordered to charge with bayonets. We ran toward the Americans, shouting banzai. Their machine guns fired continuously. Men fell like grain before a scythe. I saw hundreds die in minutes. I do not know how I survived. When I woke in American captivity, my first thought was that I had maintained my toothbrush, but failed to bring enough bullets. That thought seemed to summarize everything wrong with how we fought the war." Japanese tactical doctrine also neglected combined arms coordination. Artillery, air support, and armor operated independently rather than in coordination with infantry. This reflected organizational issues, but also philosophical ones. Combined arms required complex logistics and communication. The individual infantryman's spirit was emphasized instead. Communication equipment was scarce and unreliable. Japanese units often attacked without radio communication between elements. Officers communicated through runners, which worked in some terrain but failed when units became separated or runners were killed. The lack of reliable communication meant that when attacks failed, commanders couldn't adjust plans. Units that ran out of ammunition couldn't request resupply. Surrounded units couldn't coordinate relief attempts. Everything depended on predetermined plans being executed through spiritual determination. Meanwhile, individual soldiers maintained their toothbrushes. Even in the worst circumstances, starving in jungle, surrounded by enemies, down to their last bullets, soldiers continued the ritual of brushing their teeth when possible. This demonstrated discipline, but it highlighted the absurdity of a system that emphasized personal ritual over practical combat effectiveness. To understand what the toothbrush symbolized to individual soldiers, we need to hear their voices through diaries, letters, and post-war testimony. Private Hiroshi Nakamura, Guadalcanal, September 1942. Today marks 50 days since we landed. I have eaten nothing but grass and insects for the past week. My rifle has rust because we have no gun oil. I have 7 bullets remaining. Yesterday, Lieutenant Watanabe inspected our appearance. He struck 3 soldiers for having dirty teeth. He said maintaining proper hygiene demonstrates spiritual strength. I want to tell him that maintaining ammunition would demonstrate tactical sense, but such thoughts are dangerous. So I clean my teeth and wait to die. Corporal Takeshi Ishikawa, New Guinea, March 1943. We marched for 12 days to reach this position. We received no food beyond the 3 days' rice we carried. We ate whatever we could find. Many men have dysentery. We have been ordered to attack the Australian positions tomorrow. Each man has received 15 rounds. We have been told this is sufficient because our spirit is superior to the enemy's material advantages. I believe the officers actually believe this, but I have fought the Australians before. Their material advantages are significant. Tonight, I cleaned my teeth very carefully, because if Lieutenant Nakamura survives tomorrow, he will inspect those who also survive, and I do not wish to be beaten on top of being shot. These diary entries reveal something important. Many Japanese soldiers understood that the system was failing them. They weren't stupid or fanatical. They recognized that spiritual strength didn't stop bullets, that hunger weakened combat effectiveness, and that proper logistics mattered. But they couldn't express these thoughts openly. Questioning Seishin doctrine was considered cowardice or treason. So soldiers maintained the required rituals, including toothbrush maintenance, while privately doubting the philosophy behind them. Some soldiers found genuine spiritual comfort in the rituals. Private First Class Masao Oka, who survived the war, explained, "The toothbrush was something I could control. I couldn't control whether supply ships arrived. I couldn't control how many bullets I received. I couldn't control whether I lived or died, but I could keep my teeth clean. That small control, that small routine, helped me maintain sanity in insane circumstances." This psychological function was real and valuable. Maintaining daily routines, even small ones like brushing teeth, helped soldiers cope with chaos and uncertainty. The toothbrush provided structure and normalcy in a world of violence and deprivation. But there's a difference between individual soldiers finding comfort in ritual and an entire military system prioritizing ritual over effectiveness. Some soldiers internalized the Seishin doctrine completely. These soldiers genuinely believed that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness. Private Yoshiro Tanaka's diary from Palelu shows this mindset. "We have no food and little water. Ammunition is nearly exhausted. American shells fall constantly. Many comrades have died. But our spirit remains strong. We will defeat the Americans through the power of our loyalty to the Emperor. Each morning, I clean my teeth and meditate on my duty. These practices give me strength that bullets cannot provide." Tanaka died in a banzai charge 3 days after writing that entry. His body was found with his toothbrush in his pocket and an empty rifle in his hands. Other soldiers became cynical. Sergeant Haruo Yoshida, who survived Imphal, wrote bitterly after the war, "The officers told us spirit would triumph. Spirit did not triumph. We starved. We died of disease. We ran out of ammunition. And we retreated in chaos. But throughout it all, we were ordered to maintain appearance and hygiene. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't been killing us. I kept my toothbrush because I would be beaten if I didn't. I kept it as a symbol of everything wrong with how Japan fought the war." The experience of Japanese soldiers varied by theater and command. Some units had reasonably competent logistics. Some commanders understood the importance of supply and worked within the system's constraints to keep their soldiers equipped. But the overall pattern was consistent. Individual soldiers received intensive indoctrination on spiritual matters and personal discipline, while receiving inadequate logistical support for actual combat. Letters home from soldiers reflected this. Censorship prevented direct criticism, but soldiers found ways to communicate their situation. One common approach was to request specific items from home, not toothbrushes, which they had, but food, medicine, and other supplies that should have been provided by the military, but weren't. Private Kenji Yamamoto wrote to his mother in February 1943, "Dear Mother, thank you for your last package. The dried fish was especially welcome. We are well supplied with cleaning items, but food is sometimes scarce. If you can send more dried fish or pickled vegetables, they would be appreciated. Please do not worry. We maintain proper discipline, and our spirits are high." Reading between the lines, "We're starving. Please send food. I can't tell you directly, but you understand." The psychological toll of fighting under these conditions was immense. Soldiers experienced the cognitive dissonance of being told their spiritual strength was paramount, while watching comrades die from preventable causes like malnutrition, untreated wounds, and lack of ammunition. Some soldiers broke mentally, others became fatalistic, accepting death as inevitable. Many developed a dark humor about the situation. Veterans recalled jokes about the toothbrush. "Our final order will be to charge with clean teeth and empty rifles." The toothbrush over bullets philosophy didn't just symbolize Japanese military problems, it contributed directly to Japan's defeat. Consider the arithmetic of ammunition consumption. In the Battle of Okinawa, American forces fired approximately 200 million rifle and machine gun rounds. Japanese defenders, despite having initially adequate stocks, ran short within weeks because resupply was impossible and conservation wasn't emphasized in doctrine. American forces, by contrast, could afford to fire liberally because their logistics system ensured continuous resupply. This meant American soldiers could suppress enemy positions with automatic weapons fire, use reconnaissance by fire, and generally employ firepower rather than manpower to solve tactical problems. Japanese soldiers, conserving scarce ammunition, couldn't employ the same tactics. They relied on close-range attacks, infiltration, and hand-to-hand combat. Tactics that played to spiritual training but resulted in massive casualties. The ammunition shortage forced tactical choices that were often suicidal. Commanders ordered night infiltration attacks not because they were the best tactic, but because they conserved ammunition. Soldiers crawled close to American positions before opening fire, hoping to make every shot count. These tactics sometimes succeeded in inflicting casualties, but they were attritional nightmares for Japanese forces. Every attack consumed soldiers who couldn't be replaced, while American losses were sustainable. The broader logistical failures compounded the ammunition problem. Soldiers fighting on inadequate food were less effective. Malnourished soldiers got sick more easily, healed more slowly from wounds, and suffered from reduced strength and endurance. Disease killed more Japanese soldiers than enemy action in several campaigns. On Guadalcanal, estimated 25,000 Japanese soldiers died, roughly 5,000 in combat, 20,000 from starvation and disease. These deaths resulted directly from logistical failure, which stemmed from the military philosophy that de-emphasized material considerations. The contrast with American logistics was stark. American forces in the Pacific received more supplies than they could consume. Supply dumps accumulated material. Soldiers ate well, received regular resupply of ammunition, and had access to medical care that would save lives. This wasn't just about industrial capacity. The Soviet Union had industrial capacity comparable to Japan's, yet Soviet forces maintained better logistics than Japan. The difference was doctrinal. Soviet doctrine emphasized logistics, even if execution was sometimes flawed. Japanese doctrine de-emphasized logistics in favor of spiritual factors. The Seishin philosophy also affected strategic decisions. Japanese war planning assumed that superior spirit would allow Japan to fight a protracted war against the United States, despite massive material disadvantage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who opposed war with America, understood the problem. He reportedly said, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have no confidence." He understood that Japan couldn't match American industrial production in a long war, but army leaders, steeped in Seishin doctrine, believed Japanese soldiers' superior spirit would allow them to fight on regardless of material shortages. They planned for a war of attrition that Japan had no capacity to win. This strategic delusion stemmed directly from the same philosophy that prioritized toothbrushes over bullets at the tactical level. At all levels, strategic, operational, tactical, the Japanese military system consistently undervalued material factors and overvalued spiritual ones. The consequences were systematic. At the strategic level, Japan entered a war it couldn't sustain, expecting spirit to overcome industrial disparity. At the operational level, Japanese forces launched offensives without adequate logistics, expecting soldiers to succeed through determination, despite material shortages. At the tactical level, Japanese soldiers attacked well-supplied enemies while short on ammunition and food, expecting spiritual strength to overcome firepower disadvantage. This wasn't just poor planning. It was a coherent worldview that happened to be catastrophically wrong when matched against an enemy with both material superiority and adequate fighting spirit. The tragedy was that individual Japanese soldiers were excellent fighters. They were brave, disciplined, and tough. Given adequate supplies and sound tactics, they were formidable opponents. Allied forces learned to respect Japanese soldiers' fighting qualities. But the system wasted these excellent soldiers through a philosophy that valued symbolic gestures, like maintaining a toothbrush, over practical necessities, like adequate ammunition. By 1944-45, the contradictions had become impossible to ignore. Japan was losing on every front. Soldiers were starving, ammunition was scarce, equipment was falling apart. But the official doctrine still emphasized spirit over material. Captain Shiro Saito, stationed in the Philippines in 1944, wrote in his diary, "We have been told that our spiritual strength will allow us to defeat the Americans. I have believed this, or tried to believe it, but I watch my soldiers die from hunger, from disease, from lack of medicine that exists in Japan, but cannot reach us. I watch them fight with determination and courage, only to be destroyed by American artillery and aircraft. They die with clean teeth and empty rifles. I begin to question whether our generals understand what war has become." The ultimate irony was that Japan's surrender came not from a collapse of fighting spirit, but from material reality. Japanese soldiers were still willing to fight. Seishin had succeeded in creating motivated fighters, but they had nothing left to fight with. The atomic bombs demonstrated that Japan faced an enemy with material capabilities beyond resistance, no matter how strong the spirit. The Japanese military wasn't unique in valuing morale and fighting spirit. Every effective military recognizes that motivation matters, but most armies balanced spiritual factors with material ones more effectively than Japan. The German Wehrmacht provides an instructive comparison. German soldiers were also highly motivated, disciplined, and willing to fight tenaciously. German military culture emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice. But German logistics, while imperfect, were far superior to Japanese logistics. German soldiers generally had adequate ammunition. When supply problems occurred, they were usually due to operational circumstances, extended supply lines, partisan attacks, Allied bombing, rather than systematic neglect. German military doctrine emphasized combined arms warfare, where infantry, armor, artillery, and air support worked together. This required functional logistics and communication systems. German planners understood that tactical success depended on material support. Germany still lost the war, but not because their soldiers lacked ammunition while carrying grooming supplies. Germany lost because it fought enemies with greater industrial capacity and made strategic blunders. German tactical and operational effectiveness was generally high throughout the war. The Soviet Red Army offers another comparison. Soviet soldiers were motivated by a combination of patriotism, political indoctrination, fear of punishment, and hatred of invaders. Soviet military culture was brutal. Deserters were shot. Punishment units were sent on suicidal missions, and casualties were accepted that Western armies would find unacceptable. But Soviet logistics, despite legendary inefficiencies, generally kept soldiers supplied with ammunition and basic necessities. Soviet doctrine emphasized massive artillery barrages and overwhelming firepower. This required ammunition, lots of it, and the Soviet system provided it. Soviet soldiers might lack adequate food or winter clothing, but they rarely lacked ammunition. The system prioritized combat effectiveness over comfort, but it understood that combat effectiveness required bullets. The British Army combined professional military tradition with modern logistics. British soldiers were motivated by patriotism and unit cohesion rather than fanatical ideology. British military culture emphasized adaptability and practical problem-solving. British logistics in World War II were excellent. British forces operating at the end of extended supply lines, North Africa, Burma, Pacific, generally maintained supply. British soldiers might complain about boredom or heat or insects, but they had ammunition, food, and medical support. The United States Army represented the most extreme emphasis on material factors. American military culture didn't emphasize spiritual preparation or ideological indoctrination. American soldiers were motivated by practical factors: competent leadership, good equipment, rotation policies, and the belief that the war would end eventually. American logistics were overwhelming. American forces consumed supplies at rates that seemed wasteful to other armies. American soldiers ate well, received regular replacement equipment, and had access to medical care unmatched by any other military. But this material emphasis didn't mean American soldiers lacked fighting spirit. When properly led and fighting for clear objectives, American soldiers fought tenaciously. The difference was that American doctrine saw material support as enabling fighting spirit rather than as opposed to it. American military planners understood that soldiers fight better when well supplied. A soldier with adequate food, ammunition, and medical support is more effective than a spiritually indoctrinated soldier without these things. This seems obvious, but it contradicted Japanese military philosophy, which held that material comfort weakened spiritual strength. Japanese doctrine deliberately imposed hardship to build character, even when that hardship reduced combat effectiveness. Comparing personal items soldiers carried is revealing. Japanese soldier, Pacific, 1943. Rifle, often poorly maintained due to lack of gun oil. 20 to 40 rounds of ammunition, sometimes less. 3 days of rice, often already consumed. Toothbrush, always present and well maintained. Personal items, photos, good luck charms. Entrenching tool. Water bottle, often empty due to supply problems. American soldier, Pacific, 1943. Rifle, well maintained. Spare parts available. 80 to 100 rounds of ammunition, easily resupplied. Several days of rations, K rations, C rations. Toothbrush and other toiletries. First aid kit with sulfa drugs and morphine. Entrenching tool. 2 canteens. Water supply generally reliable. Spare socks and underwear. The American soldier carried more material comfort items, not because American culture was soft, but because American logistics could provide them. The American soldier's effectiveness in combat was enhanced by adequate supply, not diminished. Japanese military theorists would have argued that the American soldier's comfort made him weak, that the Japanese soldier's hardship made him strong. Combat results proved otherwise. American soldiers fought effectively when required, and their material support made them more effective, not less. The toothbrush comparison is particularly telling. Both American and Japanese soldiers carried toothbrushes, but the American soldier's toothbrush was one item among many in a well-supplied kit. The Japanese soldier's toothbrush was often the only item that was reliably supplied, maintained, while other essentials ran short. This symbolized the different military philosophies. American doctrine: keep soldiers supplied with everything they need to fight effectively, including personal comfort items. Japanese doctrine: keep soldiers supplied with items that demonstrate spiritual discipline, even if practical necessities are scarce. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, surviving soldiers and officers had to reconcile their wartime experiences with the philosophy that had shaped them. For many veterans, the toothbrush became a bitter symbol. Captain Takeshi Nakamura, who survived the war and later became a professor of military history, wrote in his memoirs, "We were taught that spirit would overcome material. We believed this, or tried to believe it, but material factors won the war. American industrial capacity, logistics, and firepower defeated us regardless of our spirit." The toothbrush I maintained so carefully throughout the war now seems like a symbol of everything misguided about our military philosophy. Some veterans defended the Seishin Doctrine even after defeat. They argued that Japan's spirit had been correct, but that material circumstances had been too overwhelming. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the most prominent advocates of spiritual warfare, never fully accepted that the philosophy was flawed. Tsuji wrote after the war, "Our soldiers' spirit was incomparable. We were defeated by overwhelming material superiority, not by any failing of spirit. If Japan had possessed resources equal to America's, our superior spirit would have ensured victory." This argument missed the point. The question wasn't whether spirit mattered, it did, but whether Japanese military doctrine had properly balanced spiritual and material factors. The evidence suggests it had not. Other officers engaged in more honest self-criticism. Lieutenant General Shichiru Sato, who commanded forces in Burma, wrote, "We were wrong. I was wrong. We sent soldiers into battle with inadequate supplies because we believed spirit would compensate. It did not. Soldiers died needlessly because we prioritized spiritual purity over practical necessities. I carry this burden for the rest of my life." The post-war Japanese self-defense forces learned from these mistakes. The JSDF, established in 1954, emphasizes professional military competence, modern equipment, and adequate logistics. There is still emphasis on discipline and esprit de corps, but not at the expense of material readiness. JSDF doctrine acknowledges the importance of morale and motivation, but treats them as one factor among many in military effectiveness, not as the overriding factor that can overcome all material deficiencies. Surviving veterans had mixed reactions to post-war discussions of the Seishin Doctrine. Some felt vindicated. Finally, people acknowledged that the philosophy had been flawed. Others felt their sacrifices were being minimized, as if recognizing the flawed philosophy meant their courage and suffering hadn't mattered. Private First Class Akira Sato, who survived Iwo Jima, expressed this tension. "When people now say that our military philosophy was wrong, I agree. It was wrong. We should have been better supplied. We should have received adequate ammunition and food." But saying this seems to diminish what we endured, how we fought, how many died. Our sacrifice was real, even if the philosophy that demanded it was flawed. This is a fair point. Recognizing that the Seishin Doctrine was misguided doesn't diminish individual soldiers' courage or suffering. Japanese soldiers fought bravely under terrible conditions. The tragedy is that those terrible conditions were often unnecessary, imposed by a flawed philosophy rather than by unavoidable military circumstances. The toothbrush in post-war memory became a complex symbol. For some veterans, it represented absurd priorities, maintaining hygiene while starving. For others, it represented their personal discipline and their ability to maintain humanity in inhumane circumstances. For historians, it represents the Japanese military's fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. Post-war Japanese popular culture rarely addressed these issues directly. Discussion of the war was complicated by politics, memory, and trauma. But in veterans organizations and military history circles, Debate about the Seishin Doctrine continued for decades. Some argued that the doctrine wasn't entirely wrong, that spiritual factors do matter in war, and that Japanese soldiers' courage and discipline were real advantages. They argued that the problem was imbalance, too much emphasis on spirit, too little on logistics, rather than that spirit was irrelevant. This is probably the fairest assessment. No military can succeed without motivated soldiers. Fighting spirit, unit cohesion, and willingness to endure hardship all contribute to military effectiveness. The Japanese military was correct that these factors matter. The error was in believing these factors could substitute for material adequacy rather than complement it. The most effective militaries combine high morale with adequate logistics, motivation with materiel, spirit with supplies. The toothbrush wasn't wrong. The bullet shortage was wrong. The tragedy was prioritizing one over the other. The story of the toothbrush and the bullet isn't just about World War II or the Imperial Japanese Army. It's about the eternal tension in military affairs between spirit and material, between what warriors carry in their hearts and what they carry in their packs. Every military must address this tension. Soldiers need motivation, discipline, and cohesion. But they also need weapons, ammunition, food, and medical support. The challenge is achieving the right balance. The Japanese military's emphasis on Seishin represented an extreme position on this spectrum. Spiritual factors prioritized so heavily that material factors were systematically neglected. This philosophy produced soldiers of extraordinary toughness and dedication, but failed to provide them with the tools needed to win a modern industrial war. The toothbrush symbolized everything the Japanese military did well: personal discipline, attention to detail, maintenance of standards under adverse conditions, spiritual preparation for hardship. These are all valuable military qualities. But a military needs more than personal discipline. It needs functioning logistics, adequate supplies, and doctrine that acknowledges material realities. The bullet represents these practical necessities, less spiritually satisfying than the toothbrush perhaps, but absolutely essential for combat effectiveness. The tragedy of the Japanese soldier in World War II was that he was prepared for the wrong war. He was prepared spiritually, physically, and psychologically to endure hardship, to fight with determination, and to die with honor. But he was inadequately prepared with the practical tools, ammunition, food, medicine, communication equipment, logistical support needed to fight effectively against well-supplied modern armies. This wasn't the soldier's failure. Individual Japanese soldiers were as capable as any in the world. It was a systems failure, stemming from a military philosophy that misunderstood what modern warfare required. The lessons extend beyond Japan or World War II. Lesson 1. Morale and logistics are both essential. Neglecting either reduces military effectiveness. The most successful militaries maintain both high morale and adequate supply. Lesson 2. Doctrine must correspond to reality. Believing that spirit can overcome material limitations doesn't make it true, no matter how deeply the belief is held or how fiercely it's indoctrinated. Lesson 3. Small symbols reveal large truths. The prioritization of toothbrushes over bullets wasn't just an amusing anecdote. It reflected a fundamental philosophical orientation that shaped Japanese military performance at every level. Lesson 4. Even flawed systems can produce effective soldiers at the individual level. Japanese soldiers' courage and discipline were genuine. But individual excellence can't overcome systematic failure. Lesson 5. Military effectiveness requires balance. Overemphasizing any single factor, whether spiritual motivation, technological superiority, or numerical advantage, at the expense of others, creates vulnerability. Modern militaries understand these lessons better than the Imperial Japanese Army did. contemporary military doctrine across the world recognizes that successful operations require integration of multiple factors: morale, training, equipment, logistics, tactics, strategy, and leadership. The toothbrush still appears in modern military training. Soldiers in many armies are taught personal hygiene and self-discipline. But no modern professional military believes that maintaining a toothbrush is more important than maintaining ammunition supply. The image of the Japanese soldier with a toothbrush but insufficient bullets should stand as a warning against military philosophies that prioritize symbolism over substance, ritual over practicality, spiritual preparation over material readiness. It should also stand as testament to the soldiers who fought under these conditions, who maintained their discipline and humanity even when their system failed them, who cleaned their teeth even while starving, who fought bravely even when inadequately supplied. They deserved better from their military leadership. They deserved a system that valued them enough to keep them supplied with the tools to fight effectively. They deserved bullets as much as toothbrushes. The tragedy is that they received one, but not the other. And that decision to prioritize spiritual purity over practical effectiveness contributed to Japan's defeat and to the unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who fought courageously in a war their doctrine was unprepared to win. Every Japanese soldier carried a toothbrush. Not all of them had enough bullets. That single fact explains much about why Japan lost World War II.